Hi, my name is Mercedes. I'm the education organizer for Metro Justice and the Alliance for Quality Education. And I'm here today with Ashley, an organizer with Metro Justice, and Colin, the organizer director. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Poor People's Campaign. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
So the Poor People's Campaign is a branch off of the Civil Rights Movement, which Dr. Martin Luther King was heavily involved in. I think the Civil Rights Movement got to a place where Martin Luther King was like, this is going in a direction that we wanted it to go. However, we see another piece where a lot of people are living in poverty, and that needs to be addressed. And that is how the Poor People's Campaign started. In 1968, when Martin Luther King died, so did the Poor People's Campaign. So now, the new Poor People's Campaign is kind of like a picking up of that mantle and keeping it going all across the nation.
And the campaign is really focusing nationwide on 4 different evils, right? The evils of racism, systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, and militarism.
Can you tell me how the Poor People's Campaign is targeting racism?
So I think that all of the issues that the Poor People's Campaign are kind of intersectional. I don't think that you can talk about poverty without talking about racism. You can't talk about racism without talking about poverty. When we look at it, I think the Poor People's Campaign was very deliberate and kind of mobilizing people to understand that poverty is just not about color lines, but it surpasses color lines, and it's more about the 99%. So at this point, we're kind of saying it doesn't have a color, although we know that we see that most Black and brown people are in poverty, but poverty doesn't have a color in the Poor People's Campaign. We're saying that it doesn't matter what color you are, you're at the 99%, and we're trying to mobilize people to be able to do something about that.
But as we know, in many ways, right, poverty in America specifically is really racialized, and so. If you're in Monroe County, for instance, right, like you're 3.5 times more likely to be living in poverty in Monroe County if you're Black or Latino than if you're white. So it ends up having this very like racialized history and current day sort of standing. And so to organize around poverty and not think we need to have a real focus in tackling white supremacy and racial injustice in this country would be sort of divorced from the reality of poverty here. Right?
Yeah. Can you tell me more about how poverty and racism are entwined?
I believe, if I'm honest, that there are systems that were deliberately built to keep people of color in poverty. When we think about generational wealth, when we think about redlining, all of that stuff was done deliberately, and now we see the effects of it today, where the likelihood of seeing Black and brown people owning houses or land or businesses or property is slim to none because these systems are put in deliberately.
Yeah, and, in many ways, the American economy is really built on this basis of like profit-driven through exploitation, right? Now, in sort of the early founding of the country, that exploitation was like the extreme exploitation of chattel slavery and genocide of Native Americans and theft of their land, right? So that exploitation was the birthing of the country in many ways, right? Today, that exploitation happens through low wages, high college tuition rates, high healthcare costs, high rents, food deserts. That exploitation happens in a bunch of ways today, and still, just as it did, a couple hundred years ago, has really racialized outcomes and impacts. And so while there are still many poor people in the country that are white, the likelihood of being poor if you're Black or Latino is incredibly higher, and that's because of these systems of oppression still continuing on through the ages, right? So like I said, to try and pull these two apart and not treat them as if they're intertwined systems that are totally stuck together and need to be fought together would just be detached from reality.
I think it's also, too, the narrative that's built behind being poor and being a person of color versus being poor and being a white person. A lot of times we see in the media or just in everyday life that when we describe a poor person, one, we blame them for being poor. And then two, we always say it's because they're lazy or they don't, want to do better. They're not pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, and that's not accurate at all.
And sort of amazing, actually. This is always something I'm really interested about as somebody from the Rust Belt, Buffalo and Rochester, right? Like, if poverty is based on these individualist traits of being like lazy or not smart enough or not hardworking enough or any of those things, right? Why is it so geographically concentrated? Do there just happen to be a whole lot more lazy and dumb people in Buffalo and Rochester than the rest of the country? Or were there like mass programs that dismantled the industrial base that these cities used to live on and has moved wealth out of the country, because those are the things that actually determine poverty. So, what really determines poverty ends up being these large systems, and white supremacy is very clearly one of them.
Yeah.
So in the media, you hear a lot about two other systems as well, being the school-to-prison pipeline and the industrial complex. Can you tell me how those play into the Poor People's Campaign?
I believe the school of prison pipeline is another form of brutality and just an effect of poverty. Living in Rochester, you know that you have 25,000 kids that live below poverty line. So that's 25,000 kids going to school hungry, not knowing if they're coming home to gas and electric being on or off, not knowing if their parents are facing eviction, not knowing if their parents are there to help them with their homework or come to PTO meetings. And we know that the lack of stability affects kids' behaviors at school, however that comes across or however that is like manifested. And then we have school staffed with mostly teachers that don't look like our kids and don't know how to deal with our kids. And instead of being able to navigate situations that do come up, we put in metal detector systems or suspend kids or call officers, which inadvertently puts them in the system. And once kids are in the system, we know that the likelihood of them getting out of the system is slim to none. So it's deliberate, it's on purpose, and it's beyond ridiculous.
So now that we know what these systems are, what can we do to change them?
I think organizing, I think empowering young people to organize is a big part of it. Schools and systems get money when kids are in seats, right? So we can come and we can rally and we can have interviews, and all of those things are very helpful. But until we empower young people, until we empower kids to take action, I think you'll see change, but it'll be very slow. You're an educational organizer, so you know how slow it can go. Monroe County alone is owed millions of dollars to our urban schools. That's taken years to even fight against it at all. So one, I think empowering our young people to organize. Two, I think empowering our citizens to vote. And then being deliberate about getting them transportation to vote. I think political education is huge. Like, we can do, all of the stuff that we're doing. We can organize and we can rally, but until people are going to the polls and dethroning these entities and these people that are in position to make policies that we don't benefit from, I think change will slowly happen.
Yeah, and I think, it really, to me, the Poor People's Campaign and social movements historically and now are really built on the same sort of notion, right? We need to adjust the power imbalance, right? The impacts that happen to people don't happen to people just because of who they are or what they're doing. They happen because power is imbalanced in this country, and those who have say over where resources go take it where they want to take it rather than give it to everybody, right? So I think the Poor People's Campaign is really built on this notion of building the multiracial army of the poor, right? And I think coming from the sort of moment when that campaign really blew up in the 60s, in like 67, 68, Dr. King said, what we're going to need to really tackle this is a radical redistribution of political and economic power in this country. That radical redistribution comes across only when people organize, fight for it, and demand it, and are willing to take disruptive action to make it so, right? Are willing to actually get in the streets, take over schools, take over board meetings, take over the halls of Albany and DC, right? Those are the moments when we really start to see significant change. And that's really what the Poor People's Campaign is based on. It's what Metro Justice has been based on for many years. It's what movements all over time have done. And I think we're in a moment now where we need this sort of social movement in the United States to really take on that radical redistribution of political and economic power.
Well, thank you both for coming today and sharing that information with me.
Thank you.
you.